On a freezing Chicago morning, a woman made her 12th call to security, accusing her black single-father neighbor of stealing confidential building files. Within minutes, security surrounded Malcolm Avery in front of his terrified 9-year-old son. Yet while everyone watched the quiet father prepare to be handcuffed, no one noticed the small brass house resting in his hand, or understood why he refused to reveal the truth. Because the biggest secret inside Lakeview Terrace wasn't hidden in those boxes. It was that the man they had spent 5 weeks trying to drive out was the rightful owner of the entire building. The morning air over Chicago carried the sharp bite of late November, cold enough to leave a thin layer of frost clinging to the edges of parked cars outside Lakeview Terrace. Residents hurried through the lobby with paper coffee cups tucked inside gloved hands, their footsteps echoing softly across the polished stone floor. It should have been another ordinary weekday. Instead, Vanessa Collins stood behind the sheer curtain of her 8th-floor window with a phone pressed tightly against her ear. "He's doing it again," she said, never taking her eyes off the parking lot below. "The man in 8F is loading boxes into his SUV. They look like office files. I think he's stealing building records." She paused just long enough to listen. Yes, that's him. Black male, early 40s, grey jacket. Hurry before he drives away. By the time she ended the call, Malcolm Avery had already lifted another cardboard archive box into the back of his dark blue SUV. He moved carefully, as though each box contained something fragile rather than stacks of paperwork. Every movement was calm, measured, practiced. 9-year-old Eli sat buckled into the back seat, his backpack resting beside him. He traced little circles on the fogged window with one finger while watching his father through the glass. "Dad," he called softly after Malcolm closed the tailgate halfway. "Are we still making it to school on time?" Malcolm looked over his shoulder and smiled, though it never quite reached his tired eyes. "We're going to try, buddy." The smile disappeared the moment flashing amber lights rolled into the driveway. A security SUV stopped sideways across the exit, completely blocking Malcolm's vehicle. The driver's door opened before the engine finished idling. Gavin Price, the building's head of security, stepped out with 2 officers behind him. His radio crackled against his shoulder, while one hand rested near the restraints hanging from his duty belt. "Sir," Gavin called firmly, "step away from the vehicle." Several residents slowed their pace. A woman walking her dog stopped near the mailboxes. Someone held the lobby door open, just long enough to watch. Malcolm quietly lowered the box in his hands onto the pavement. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. "We received another report concerning unauthorized removal of building property." Another report. Neither man needed to explain which report. Gavin took 2 deliberate steps closer. "I need you to keep your hands where I can see them." Inside the SUV, Eli straightened in his seat. His small fingers curled tightly around the shoulder strap of his backpack. "Dad?" "I'm right here," Malcolm answered without taking his eyes off the security team. Gavin nodded toward the open cargo area. "Open every box." They contained documents. "What kind of documents?" "They aren't leaving the property permanently." That wasn't my question. The silence that followed stretched across the parking lot. Cold wind carried a handful of brown leaves between them. Malcolm could feel dozens of eyes watching from balconies and windows above. He'd experienced moments like this before. People waiting to see whether calm would survive suspicion. Slowly, Malcolm reached into the pocket of his jacket. Gavin immediately stiffened. "Easy." His hand settled more firmly near the restraints. "I said, keep your hands visible." Malcolm stopped without argument. I was reaching for my wallet. You can do that when I tell you. Behind the windshield, Eli pressed both palms against the glass. Dad? His voice trembled just enough for Malcolm to hear it. Malcolm turned only his head. It's okay. No one else seemed convinced. One of the younger security officers walked toward the SUV and glanced inside. You need to stay seated, son. Eli nodded quickly. He wasn't crying. Not yet. Malcolm looked down at his open hand. Resting in his palm was a small brass keychain shaped like a house. The edges had been worn smooth over many years. One corner carried a shallow dent that caught the morning light. His thumb brushed across it almost unconsciously. For just a heartbeat, everything around him seemed quieter. The radios, the traffic, the whispers gathering behind the lobby doors. It was as though he were remembering something no one else could see. Gavin mistook the pause for hesitation. Sir, if those files belong to building management, removing them without authorization is a serious matter. Malcolm lifted his eyes. I understand. And if you cooperate, this can stay simple. Again, Malcolm nodded. He never raised his voice. He never argued. He simply stood between the security officers and the frightened little boy, watching through the window. From the 8th floor, Vanessa folded her arms. For the 12th time in 5 weeks, she was certain she had finally been proven right. What she could not possibly know was that every second Malcolm remained silent was a choice, and that no one standing in that parking lot, not the residents, not the security officers, not even the woman who had made the call, had any idea why the quiet man they surrounded had allowed this to reach a 12th report before saying a single word about who he truly was. 5 weeks earlier, Lakeview Terrace had looked completely different. The maple trees lining the sidewalks still held their orange leaves, and the morning sun spilled across the brick courtyard with a warmth that made the old apartment building seem younger than its 58 years. Delivery trucks came and went. Teachers hurried toward nearby schools with travel mugs in hand. A retired couple argued playfully over whose turn it was to walk their beagle. It was the kind of place where people nodded before they learned each other's names. A rented moving truck rolled slowly to the curb beneath the faded green sign that read, Lakeview Terrace Apartments. Malcolm Avery climbed down first. He wore worn blue jeans, work boots, and a grey sweatshirt with dried paint on one sleeve. Nothing about him suggested authority. He looked like every other father trying to finish a move before lunch. 9-year-old Eli jumped down after him, carrying a cardboard box nearly half his size. I got this one, he announced proudly. Malcolm laughed. I know you do. Together they walked toward apartment 8F. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh coffee, old wood polish, and the lemon cleaner the maintenance crew used every Friday morning. Their apartment door opened with a quiet click. Sunlight poured through a wide living room window overlooking the courtyard below. Eli stood frozen for a moment. Whoa! He hurried from room to room before stopping in the smaller bedroom near the corner. This one's mine. His voice echoed through nearly empty walls. He rushed to the window, carefully placing a small model train on the sill before anything else came out of the moving boxes. It wasn't expensive. Several wheels were missing. One side carried a strip of tape from where Malcolm had repaired it years earlier. Still, Eli treated it like treasure. When do we get to call this home? He asked without turning around. Malcolm looked across the quiet room. The question lingered longer than it should have. I hope soon. It wasn't the answer Eli expected, but it was the most honest one Malcolm could give. He carried another box inside before noticing one leg of the old kitchen table wobbling badly. Without thinking, he unpacked a small tool pouch, tightened 2 loose bolts, and steadied the table in less than a minute. A passing resident stopped outside the open door. "Maintenance already fixing things," the elderly woman joked. Malcolm smiled politely. "Just couldn't eat breakfast on a crooked table." She laughed. "Well, welcome anyway." Throughout the morning, he greeted everyone the same way. He held the elevator for a nurse finishing a night shift, helped an elderly veteran lift groceries onto his walker, picked up a package someone had dropped without realizing it. Every small act seemed natural. Nothing felt performed. By lunchtime, several neighbors assumed Malcolm must have worked somewhere in the building. He never corrected them. Outside, a woman watched from across the courtyard. Vanessa Collins stood on her balcony with perfectly trimmed flower boxes lining the railing. She studied Malcolm for several quiet minutes. Her eyes followed every trip between the truck and apartment 8F. The faded clothes, the heavy lifting, the toolbox, the easy smile. She never once saw him speak loudly, never once saw him complain. Yet something about him unsettled her. She disappeared inside without waving. Late that afternoon, Malcolm locked the moving truck and stretched his sore shoulders. His phone buzzed. Claire Bennett. He read the message without opening it fully. "The board can wait another week if you need it." He slipped the phone back into his pocket before Eli noticed. "Dad?" "Yeah? Can we put the train tracks together tonight?" Malcolm looked toward the little plastic locomotive waiting patiently on the bedroom windowsill. "We sure can." Father and son carried the final box upstairs together. Across the courtyard, unseen behind another curtain, Vanessa continued watching apartment 8F. She still didn't know the new neighbor's name. But before the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline, she had already decided. He didn't belong there. Vanessa Collins had lived at Lakeview Terrace for nearly 12 years. In that time, she had become something more than a long-time resident. She organized holiday decorations in the lobby, chaired resident meetings when the property manager was unavailable, and somehow always knew who had moved in before the welcome packets reached their mailboxes. People often described her as attentive. Few realized how closely she watched everyone around her. The following morning, she saw Malcolm helping Mrs. Evelyn Carter, an 80-year-old widow recovering from hip surgery. The older woman struggled to carry a narrow bookshelf from the delivery truck to her apartment. Before she could ask anyone else, Malcolm set down his own moving box. "I've got it," he said with an easy smile. "It isn't heavy." Mrs. Carter chuckled. "Oh, honey, everything feels heavy these days." He carried the bookshelf upstairs, assembled it in her living room using the same worn tool pouch he'd unpacked the day before, and refused the $20 bill she tried to press into his hand. "Buy yourself something nice," she insisted. "You already did," Malcolm replied. "You reminded Eli what homemade chocolate chip cookies smell like." Mrs. Carter laughed until tears gathered in her eyes. From across the hallway, Vanessa watched every second. She didn't see kindness. She saw a man entering another resident's apartment. 10 minutes later, the security office received its first call. "A man who doesn't belong here is going door to door," Vanessa reported. "You should check before something disappears." 2 security officers arrived politely. One of them, a younger guard named Daniel Ruiz, approached Malcolm near the elevator. Sir, sorry to bother you. We received a report. Malcolm nodded before Daniel even finished. What do you need? Resident ID, please. Malcolm reached into his wallet, produced his building access card, and waited while Daniel checked the apartment number. Everything matched. Daniel handed it back with an apologetic smile. Sorry about that. No problem. Mrs. Carter stepped into the hallway. He was helping me. Daniel thanked her and left. The entire encounter lasted less than 3 minutes. Malcolm returned to unpacking. He said nothing more about it. That afternoon, Eli discovered a bicycle lying upside down near the garage entrance. A boy around his age sat beside it, staring at a broken chain. My mum said, "We're probably walking home." The boy sighed. Malcolm crouched beside the bike. Mind if I take a look? Within minutes, grease covered his fingers. He adjusted the chain, tightened the rear wheel, and spun the pedals. The bike rolled smoothly again. The boy's face lit up. Seriously? Malcolm grinned. Give it a try. The bicycle barely reached the sidewalk before Vanessa appeared at another window. By evening, security received a second report. This man is repairing equipment in the parking garage, she warned. Does he even work here? Daniel returned. Recognition crossed his face almost immediately. I'm guessing another complaint. Malcolm gave a quiet smile. I was guessing the same thing. Daniel checked his resident badge once more. Everything was in order. I'm sorry. No apology necessary. As Daniel walked away, Malcolm opened the Notes app on his phone. October 9th, security contact. Daniel Ruiz, complaint unfounded. He locked the screen before Eli looked over. Dad, why are you writing everything down? Just keeping good records. The answer sounded simple. It wasn't. 2 days later, the first snowfall dusted the sidewalks outside Lakeview Terrace. Before sunrise, Malcolm noticed old Mr. Henderson struggling to clear the icy ramp leading toward the entrance. Without saying a word, Malcolm picked up the spare shovel leaning against the wall and worked beside him. Steam rose from their breath into the cold morning air. They had nearly finished when another security vehicle rolled quietly into the parking lot. Daniel climbed out alone this time. He looked almost embarrassed. I'm afraid someone reported unauthorized maintenance. Mr. Henderson leaned on his shovel. You've got to be kidding. Daniel sighed. I know. Malcolm simply handed over his resident card for the third time. When Daniel left, Mr. Henderson shook his head. Son, some people don't know the difference between helping and causing trouble. Malcolm watched the security SUV disappear beyond the gate. Then he added another entry to the growing list on his phone. 3 reports, 3 different reasons, 3 identical outcomes. Late that evening, while Eli slept with his repaired model train beside his bed, Malcolm's phone vibrated across the kitchen table. Claire Bennett. Only 2 words appeared on the screen. It's time. Malcolm stared at them for a long moment before typing back. Not yet. He set the phone face down. Outside his apartment window, snow continued falling across the courtyard, covering every footprint from the day. But some patterns could not be buried nearly that easily. The next Saturday arrived wrapped in quiet. Snow rested lightly on the rooftops of Lakeview Terrace, softening the edges of the aging brick building. Inside apartment EF, the smell of pancakes drifted through the kitchen, while sunlight spilled across unpacked boxes that still waited against the walls. Eli sat cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully connecting plastic train tracks around the coffee table. "Dad," he called, "where's the little house?" Malcolm looked up from tightening the loose hinge on a cabinet door. "What little house?" "The one that's always in your wallet." For a moment, Malcolm didn't answer. Instead, he wiped his hands on a kitchen towel before reaching into his back pocket. He unfolded the worn leather wallet and placed a small brass keychain in Eli's hand. It was shaped like a simple house. Years of use had polished its edges smooth. "This one?" Malcolm asked. Eli nodded. "You never let it go." "I don't." "Why?" Malcolm pulled out a chair and sat beside him. "When I was about your age," he began quietly, "your grandpa carried this everywhere." Eli smiled. "I wish I remembered him better." "So do I." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, someone laughed in the courtyard below. A dog barked once before everything settled back into the peaceful rhythm of a winter morning. "Grandpa Walter bought this building a long time ago," Malcolm said. "It wasn't worth much back then." "Really?" "It had broken elevators, leaking pipes, empty apartments." Eli looked surprised. "This place? The very same one?" Malcolm turned the little brass house over in his palm. "People told him to tear it down." "What did he do?" "He fixed it." "By himself?" "Not alone." A smile crossed Malcolm's face. "He always said a building wasn't saved by bricks." Eli waited. It was saved by the people who finally felt safe enough to stay. The words hung quietly between them. Malcolm could almost hear his father's voice saying them again. Years earlier, Walter Avery had stood in this very apartment after replacing every broken window himself. He had handed Malcolm the brass keychain before locking up for the night. "If you ever own this place," Walter had said, "don't ask whether the walls look beautiful." He had tapped the little brass house. "Ask whether the people inside sleep peacefully." At the time, Malcolm had laughed. Back then, he had been too busy chasing architectural awards in glass towers downtown to imagine returning to an aging apartment building on the north side. Life had changed faster than either of them expected. Walter's heart attack came only months after his retirement. Malcolm still remembered arriving at the hospital too late to finish the conversation they had planned for the following weekend. That unfinished conversation followed him every day, even now. Especially now. Eli noticed his father's eyes drifting toward the window. "You miss him?" Malcolm nodded once. "Every day." The boy carefully handed the brass keychain back. "I think Grandpa would have liked it here." "I hope so." Eli returned to his train set. "So, are we staying forever?" Malcolm hesitated. He wanted to answer yes. Instead, he looked around the apartment. Fresh paint couldn't hide every crack. New curtains couldn't erase old habits. There were questions he still needed answered. People he still needed to understand. "I don't know yet." Eli looked up. "You don't?" Malcolm shook his head gently. "If this building isn't taking care of the people who live here..." He stopped himself. "I have a big decision to make." Eli accepted the answer more easily than most adults would have. He simply pushed his little train around another curve. "I hope we stay." "So do I." A soft vibration interrupted the quiet. Malcolm's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Claire Bennett. He stepped into the hallway before answering. They're asking again, Claire said. The board wants to know if you're ready to introduce yourself before the management review. Not yet. Malcolm, I need a little more time. You've already seen enough warning signs. Maybe, but I haven't seen the whole picture. Claire sighed. If you're wrong, you're putting yourself through this for nothing. Malcolm looked through the hallway window toward the courtyard below. Mrs. Carter waved at a delivery driver. Mr. Henderson brushed snow from another resident's windshield. Life continued as though everything was perfectly ordinary. I hope I am wrong, Malcolm answered softly. But if I'm right... He glanced toward the apartment where Eli's laughter echoed through the open doorway. Then this building has forgotten what my father built it to be. After ending the call, Malcolm slipped the brass house back into his wallet. He never noticed the shadow standing across the courtyard. Vanessa Collins had watched him finish the call from her balcony. She couldn't hear a single word, but she recognized one thing immediately. Whatever secret the quiet man in apartment 8F was hiding, it was important enough that someone kept asking him to reveal it. And Malcolm kept choosing silence. By the beginning of the third week, Malcolm had settled into a quiet routine. Every morning after walking Eli to the school bus on Sheridan Road, he returned through the lobby carrying the same worn canvas tool bag. He wasn't employed by Lakeview Terrace, yet loose cabinet hinges somehow stopped squeaking. Flickering hallway lights mysteriously worked again before maintenance requests were ever submitted. A wheelchair ramp that had rattled for months suddenly felt solid beneath tired hands. Most residents simply assumed the building had finally hired someone who cared. Malcolm never corrected them. One rainy afternoon, he found Mr. Douglas Harris, a Marine veteran in his 70s, struggling to steady himself near the mailroom. The aluminum handrail beside the entrance had loosened from the wall. "I've almost gone down twice this week," Mr. Harris admitted with an embarrassed laugh. "Give me 10 minutes," Malcolm said. He knelt on the cold tile floor, tightened new anchors into the wall, and tested the rail with both hands until it no longer shifted. Mr. Harris reached into his wallet. "At least let me pay you." Malcolm smiled and gently pushed the folded bills back. "You already have." The veteran frowned. "You thanked me." Mr. Harris's eyes softened. Not many people stop anymore. Later that same evening, Malcolm noticed a young mother named Amanda standing outside her apartment, her infant balanced against one shoulder while she fought with a damaged deadbolt that refused to lock. "I don't feel safe leaving it like this," she whispered. Malcolm asked no questions. He simply unpacked a replacement lock from his tool bag. Within 20 minutes, the new hardware clicked smoothly into place. Amanda exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. "I don't know how to thank you. Just get some sleep while the baby's sleeping." She laughed quietly. I forgot people still said things like that. They should. 2 days later, another small kindness passed almost unnoticed. Mrs. Ramirez from apartment 5C had recently returned home after giving birth to twins. The elevator was temporarily out of service for inspection. Malcolm climbed 4 flights of stairs carrying grocery bags filled with diapers, milk, soup, and fresh fruit without mentioning it to anyone. Eli followed behind with a paper sack holding 2 loaves of bread. "I carried something too," he announced proudly. "You sure did," Malcolm replied. Mrs. Ramirez looked at father and son standing outside her apartment and covered her mouth. "I didn't even ask." "I know," Malcolm answered. "Sometimes people shouldn't have to." As they walked back downstairs, Eli glanced at his father. "Grandpa would have helped too." Malcolm smiled. "He would have beaten us here." Across the lobby, another pair of eyes watched everything. Luis Ortega had worked the overnight cleaning shift at Lakeview Terrace for nearly 6 years. He had learned to recognize residents by the sound of their footsteps alone. Malcolm puzzled him. Owners complained. Tenants requested. Managers supervised. This man simply helped, without asking who deserved it. Late Friday evening, Luis was polishing the mailroom floor when Vanessa hurried inside carrying shopping bags. Her phone slipped from her coat pocket without her noticing. By the time she disappeared into the elevator, the phone was gone. 10 minutes later, Malcolm entered to collect the mail. He immediately spotted the device beneath a bench. The screen displayed a missed call from home. He picked it up, looked at the apartment number on the emergency contact screen, and quietly rode the elevator upstairs. Luis watched from the end of the hallway. Malcolm knocked once. No answer. He placed the phone carefully on Vanessa's welcome mat, tucked safely beside the flower pot so it wouldn't be stepped on, then walked away without leaving a note. He never mentioned finding it. He never waited for thanks. Luis stood frozen with the mop still in his hands. Something about the scene refused to fit the picture being painted by the endless complaints. A dangerous man didn't quietly return the property of someone who clearly disliked him. Luis glanced toward apartment 8F, then back at Vanessa's door. Before he could make sense of what he'd witnessed, the sharp crackle of a security radio echoed through the lobby. Unit 2 responding to another resident complaint. 8th floor. Luis slowly lowered the mop handle. This was becoming more than coincidence, and for the first time, someone besides Malcolm had begun wondering whether the wrong person was being watched. The 4th report came on a bright Saturday afternoon. The courtyard, usually quiet, echoed with the sound of children chasing a red rubber ball between the benches while parents talked beneath the last golden leaves still clinging to the trees. Eli had finally made a friend. His name was Noah, a shy 4th grader from the 6th floor who loved trains almost as much as Eli did. The boys laughed as they took turns kicking the ball across the grass. For nearly an hour, Malcolm sat on a nearby bench reading through a folder while glancing up every few minutes just to make sure Eli was smiling. Then the security SUV rolled into the courtyard. The laughter stopped almost immediately. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped out with an uncomfortable expression already written across his face. "I'm sorry, Malcolm." Malcolm closed the folder. "What is it this time?" "We received a complaint about children disturbing the common areas." The courtyard fell silent. A mother gathered her daughter by the hand. Another parent quietly called for his son. No one argued. No one wanted trouble. Within minutes, Noah's father walked over with an apologetic smile. "I think we better head upstairs." Noah looked disappointed. "But we were still playing." "I know, buddy." The little boy waved awkwardly at Eli before disappearing into the elevator with his father. Eli stared at the empty courtyard. He didn't ask any questions. He simply picked up the ball and carried it back to apartment 8F. That evening, Malcolm found the ball sitting untouched beside the front door. The 5th report arrived only 3 days later. A piano teacher named Mrs. Linda Foster came for Eli's first lesson after school. She had barely unpacked her music books when security knocked. Another complaint, an unauthorized visitor. Mrs. Foster showed her driver's license, explained why she was there, and smiled politely through the entire conversation. Still, the interruption stretched nearly 20 minutes. When the lesson finally began, Eli struggled to concentrate. His fingers hesitated above the keys, Every unexpected sound in the hallway made him glance toward the door. Mrs. Foster noticed. "So," she said gently, "same time next Tuesday." She never came back. A text message arrived the following morning, explaining that her schedule had become too full. Malcolm understood the truth without reading between the lines. The sixth complaint came after school on a rainy Wednesday. Amanda's little daughter had dropped her favorite stuffed rabbit down the stairwell between two railings. No adult could reach it. Eli volunteered before anyone asked. He carefully squeezed through the narrow gap, retrieved the toy, and climbed back out with a proud grin. Amanda hugged her daughter. "Thank you, sweetheart." The security radio crackled before the rabbit was even dry. A resident had reported unsupervised children engaging in dangerous behavior. By now, Daniel didn't bother pretending surprise. He filled out the paperwork as quickly as possible. "I'm really sorry." Malcolm nodded. "I know you are." That night, Eli ate dinner in unusual silence. His fork pushed peas into neat little rows instead of toward his mouth. Finally, he looked up. "Dad." "Yeah? Do people here not like us?" Malcolm set his own fork down. "Why would you ask that?" Eli shrugged. "Nobody stays after security comes." The words landed harder than any report Vanessa had ever filed. Malcolm reached across the table. "This isn't your fault." "I know." Eli hesitated. "But maybe if I stayed quieter." "You don't have to earn the right to laugh. I just don't want people getting in trouble because of me." Malcolm looked away for a brief moment. Outside, snowflakes drifted beneath the parking lot light. Inside, the apartment suddenly felt much smaller than it had on moving day. After Eli went to bed, Malcolm stood alone by the window overlooking the courtyard. Children's footprints from earlier that afternoon had already disappeared beneath fresh snow. He opened the notes app on his phone. 4 reports. 5, 6, 7. Each one carefully dated. Each one describing something completely ordinary. He understood something now that he had been trying not to admit. This was no longer about him. Every unnecessary knock at the door, every suspicious glance, every interrupted afternoon was quietly teaching his son that home was a place where he had to apologize simply for being seen. For the first time since arriving at Lakeview Terrace, Malcolm wondered whether keeping his silence was protecting the truth or asking too much of the little boy sleeping peacefully just down the hall. The next afternoon, Claire Bennett asked Malcolm to meet her at a small diner overlooking Lake Michigan. It was one of those old neighborhood places where the coffee never seemed to stop brewing, and every waitress knew half the customers by name. Outside, waves rolled against the concrete shoreline beneath a gray November sky, while inside the windows fogged gently from the warmth. Claire had already claimed a booth near the back. A thick manila folder rested beside her untouched coffee. "You look tired," she said as Malcolm slid into the seat across from her. "I've had better weeks." She studied his face for a moment before pushing the folder toward him. Printed across the tab were 6 simple words. Lakeview Terrace Ownership Documents. "You know why I asked you here?" Malcolm nodded without opening it. "The board is getting impatient." "They're more than impatient." Claire lowered her voice. "The annual management review is next week. They expect the owner to attend." Malcolm looked out the window. A father walked along the lake holding his little daughter's hand against the cold wind. For a second he imagined Eli beside him instead. "If I walk into that meeting now," he said quietly, everything changes. Claire folded her hands. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. It'll change too quickly. She frowned. What does that mean? They'll all know. The security team, the management office, the residents. They'll start treating me like the owner instead of another tenant. Claire leaned back. And that's a bad thing? It defeats the reason I came. Silence settled between them. A waitress topped off their coffee before moving to another table. Finally, Claire spoke again. You've already documented 7 unnecessary security responses. 7 that I know about. And your son. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stirred his coffee even though he never added cream or sugar. Eli asked me last night why people don't stay after security shows up. Claire's expression softened. He shouldn't have to ask questions like that. I know. He thinks if he laughs too loudly, someone else gets into trouble. Those words lingered between them longer than anything else Malcolm had said. Claire slowly closed the folder. You've always carried everything yourself. He gave a tired smile. I learned from my father. No. She shook her head gently. You learned responsibility from Walter. You learned loneliness all on your own. Malcolm looked down. There was truth in that. After Walter Avery died, Malcolm had handled every legal document, every repair contract, every insurance claim, every board meeting himself. When his marriage ended a year later, he made another quiet promise. Eli would never have to worry about adult problems. So Malcolm worried enough for both of them. He rarely admitted he needed help. Even now. Claire reached across the table. This isn't about proving you're strong. It's about protecting your son. I am protecting him. Were you protecting him yesterday? The question landed harder than Malcolm expected. He remembered Eli sitting silently at dinner, carefully arranging peas instead of eating them. He remembered the little pause before his son asked whether people liked them. He closed his eyes briefly. No. Claire slid the ownership documents toward him again. Then tell everyone who you are. Malcolm rested one hand on the folder, but still didn't open it. If I do that today, they'll apologize tomorrow. They'll smile. They'll suddenly remember how to be respectful. Claire nodded. Probably. But none of it will be real. He looked directly at her. I need to know how this building treats people who don't have power. What if the answer costs Eli too much? That question stayed with him. Outside, gulls drifted above the lake. Inside, Malcolm finally opened the folder. At the very top lay a resolution authorizing an independent operational review of Lakeview Terrace's management and security procedures. He picked up the pen Claire had placed beside it. I'll approve the review today. She watched carefully. But I'm asking for a few more days before anyone knows my name. Claire sighed, though she already knew what his decision would be. You always choose the harder road. Sometimes it's the only road that leads to the truth. He signed the authorization. Claire gathered the papers. I hope you're right. So do I. As Malcolm left the diner, his phone buzzed. A text from Eli. Dad, I saved your favorite seat for dinner tonight. Malcolm smiled for the first time all afternoon. Then his eyes drifted toward the grey lake stretching into the distance. He had just committed himself to waiting a little longer. What he didn't know was that those few extra days would ask for a far greater price than either he or Claire had imagined. The 9th report came on a Sunday afternoon. The first snow had melted, leaving the courtyard damp beneath a pale winter sun. Eli sat near the lobby with pieces of his model train spread across the floor, carefully rebuilding one of the tiny freight cars that had come apart the night before. He worked with the same quiet patience Malcolm always showed when fixing things. "You almost got it," Malcolm encouraged from a nearby chair, reviewing notes inside a slim folder. "I know," Eli smiled. "I just have to keep trying." A few feet away, another little boy watched curiously but was too shy to come closer. Eli looked up. "Do you want to help?" The boy nodded. Within minutes, both children were laughing over tiny plastic tracks stretching across the polished floor. It lasted less than 10 minutes. Vanessa stepped out of the elevator carrying 2 shopping bags. She stopped the moment she saw the train set. Her eyes dropped to one small wheel that had rolled across the marble tile. "What is all this?" she demanded. "The boys are just playing," Malcolm answered calmly. "This isn't a playground. They're staying out of everyone's way." Vanessa ignored him. She looked directly at Eli. "You've already scratched the floor." Both boys immediately froze. Eli stared down at the tiny wheel lying beside his shoe. "It just rolled away. I said you've damaged the lobby." Before Malcolm could stand, Vanessa reached down and grabbed the little brass house keychain dangling from Eli's backpack zipper. "So, these belong to you too." She gave it a sharp tug. The chain snapped free. The brass house struck the marble floor with a hard metallic crack. It bounced once, then slid beneath a nearby bench. Silence settled across the lobby. Eli stared after it. "My keychain?" Vanessa folded her arms. "Children shouldn't carry keys that don't belong to them." The words hung heavily in the air. Malcolm slowly stood. His chair barely made a sound. For the first time since moving into Lakeview Terrace, something changed behind his eyes. Not anger, not exactly. Something older. Something far more difficult to control. He walked past Vanessa without saying a word. Knelt beside the bench. Reached underneath. When he lifted the little brass house into the light again, one corner had been bent inward from striking the stone. His thumb traced the fresh dent. Another mark added to years of careful use. Eli's voice came quietly. "I'm sorry, Dad." Malcolm looked up immediately. "For what?" "I should have been more careful." Malcolm shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong." He clipped the damaged keychain back onto Eli's backpack instead of returning it to his own wallet. "It still works," he said softly. "Sometimes things get marked." "That doesn't mean they lose what they were made for." Vanessa gave a dismissive shrug. "If children respected shared property, situations like this wouldn't happen." Several residents had quietly gathered nearby. No one spoke. No one challenged her. Malcolm could feel every eye in the lobby waiting to see whether he would finally lose his temper. Instead, he picked up each piece of the train track from the floor. One by one, he placed them carefully into their storage box. Then he turned toward Eli. "Let's head home." The little boy nodded. As they walked toward the elevator, he slipped his hand into Malcolm's. Neither of them looked back. Inside apartment 8F, Malcolm placed the train box on the shelf before sitting alone at the kitchen table. The brass house rested in front of him beneath the warm light overhead. The new dent caught his attention every time he turned it. Walter Avery had once told him that every scratch on that little house represented another family that had found safety inside the building. Tonight, the newest mark represented something very different. A home where his own son no longer felt welcome. When Eli wandered quietly into the kitchen carrying a glass of milk, he noticed his father staring at the damaged keychain. "Can Grandpa's little house be fixed?" Malcolm managed a faint smile. "Yes. Everything worth keeping usually can." He hoped the words were true, because for the first time since he had chosen silence, he wasn't sure whether he was protecting his father's legacy or watching it break apart one small piece at a time. Monday arrived under a sky the color of worn steel. A bitter wind swept between the buildings, rattling the bare branches that overlooked the courtyard. Malcolm walked Eli to the school bus, as he always did, talking about a science project due later that week. They laughed about how impossible it was to keep glue off their fingers. For a few minutes, life felt almost normal. When school ended that afternoon, Eli hurried through the front entrance, carrying a folder filled with drawings. "Dad, we made city maps today. I can't wait to see them." As they stepped toward the elevator, Eli noticed a small sign taped beside the wall. "Residents only. Please use assigned elevators during maintenance." One of the two elevators was temporarily closed while technicians replaced a control panel, leaving everyone to share the remaining lift. Several neighbors gathered in line. Mrs. Carter smiled at Eli. "Did you have a good day at school?" "The best one this week." The elevator doors opened. People stepped inside together. Just before Malcolm pressed the button for the 8th floor, Vanessa's voice echoed through the lobby. "Hold that elevator." The doors reopened. She entered carrying a leather tote and immediately looked at Eli. "What apartment are you from?" The question caught several residents off guard. "8th floor," Eli answered politely. Vanessa folded her arms. "This elevator is primarily for residents while maintenance is being completed." Malcolm looked at her calmly. "We are residents." She ignored him. Instead, she reached toward Eli. "I'd like to see your access card." Eli instinctively stepped closer to his father. I don't carry it." Before Malcolm could respond, Vanessa placed a firm hand around the boy's wrist. "Then maybe your father should explain why you're using secured areas." Everything inside Malcolm seemed to stop. The elevator remained open. No one moved. Eli's eyes widened. "You're hurting me." Malcolm crossed the small distance in 2 quiet steps. "Please let go of my son." His voice never rose. He didn't need to. Vanessa kept hold for another long second. "I asked him a simple question. You can ask questions without touching him." Something in Malcolm's eyes finally convinced her to release her grip. The moment her fingers opened, Eli pulled his arm back against his chest. A faint red mark had already begun forming across his wrist. Malcolm knelt immediately. "Buddy, I'm okay." But his voice trembled. Malcolm carefully rolled back the sleeve of Eli's jacket. The mark was clearer now. Without saying another word, he removed his phone and quietly took one photograph. No flash. No accusation. Just one picture. Vanessa scoffed. "Oh, honestly? I barely touched him." Several residents looked away. Others remained frozen. Mrs. Carter spoke first. "He said she was hurting him." Vanessa turned sharply. "I was verifying who belongs in this building." Malcolm slowly stood. "We belong here." His words were calm. Certain. Nothing more. He placed one protective hand across Eli's shoulder. "We're going upstairs. Neither of them looked back. Inside apartment 8F, Eli sat on the couch, hugging a pillow, while Malcolm placed an ice pack inside a clean dish towel. He knelt in front of his son. "Here." Eli rested the cool towel against his wrist. After several quiet minutes, he finally asked the question Malcolm had been fearing without realizing it. "Dad, I'm here. Do people think I'm dangerous because I look like you?" The room seemed to lose every sound. The refrigerator hummed softly. Traffic drifted through the window 8 floors below. Malcolm searched for an answer worthy of a 9-year-old boy. None came. He sat beside Eli instead. "No." He paused. "Some people decide who someone is before they ever get the chance to know them. Why?" "I wish I knew." Eli stared at the fading red mark. "I tried to be polite." "I know. I even said thank you." "I know." Malcolm wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "You never have to earn the right to be treated with kindness." Eli leaned quietly against him. "I believed if I stayed nice." His voice almost disappeared. "People would stop calling security." Malcolm closed his eyes. Every report, every apology, every decision to wait, every promise to gather one more piece of evidence. They had all led to this moment. Not another complaint. Not another interrupted afternoon. His son had begun believing that kindness alone should protect him. And Malcolm knew that wasn't a burden any child should ever carry. Long after Eli fell asleep that night, Malcolm stood alone by the kitchen window. The photograph remained open on his phone. The faint mark around a little wrist. Beside it sat the brass house keychain, still carrying the fresh dent from the lobby floor. He looked from one to the other. Then, for the first time since arriving at Lakeview Terrace, he admitted aloud to the empty apartment, "I waited too long." Across the courtyard, lights still glowed inside Vanessa Collins's apartment. She sat at her dining table with stationery spread neatly before her. A blank sheet rested in front of her. She uncapped a pen, and before the ink touched the paper, she had already decided who the next complaint would be written about. Vanessa wrote slowly. Every sentence sounded measured. Every accusation sounded reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. She described Malcolm as a resident who invited unfamiliar people into the building, repaired property without authorization, encouraged children to gather in common areas, and repeatedly ignored community standards. She never mentioned Mrs. Carter's surgery. She never mentioned the veteran's loose handrail. She never mentioned the young mother's broken lock. She listed events. She removed compassion. By the time she reached the final page, kindness had been rewritten as suspicion. At the bottom, she signed her name with practiced confidence. Vanessa Collins, Resident Advisory Committee. Then she addressed the envelope. To the building owner, "If management won't act," she muttered to herself, "the owner certainly will." She sealed the envelope with complete satisfaction. Across the courtyard, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table long after Eli had gone to bed. The photograph of the red mark on his son's wrist remained open beside the growing log of security reports. 7, 8, 9, 10. Every entry carried the same ending. Complaint unfounded. He rubbed his tired eyes as another document appeared in his email inbox. From Claire Bennett. Subject: urgent. He opened it immediately. The scanned letter filled the screen. He recognized Vanessa's name before reading the first sentence. Claire had written only one line above the attachment. Someone delivered this to the board office this afternoon. I think you should read it yourself. Malcolm leaned back and slowly read every page. He never skipped a paragraph. He wanted to know exactly how Vanessa saw him. According to her letter, he was irresponsible, untrustworthy, a disruptive influence, an unfit father whose presence threatened the community. The words should have made him angry. Instead, they made him sad, not for himself, for Eli. He imagined his son growing up in a place where enough people believed those words to make them feel true. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Claire stepped into the apartment a few minutes later, carrying a thick binder beneath one arm. I thought this conversation was better in person. Malcolm poured her a cup of coffee. Neither of them touched it. Claire placed the binder on the table. Inside were copies of every security report Malcolm had documented, arranged by date. I added timestamps from the security office, she said. They match your notes almost perfectly. Malcolm turned the pages quietly. Then Claire removed a small flash drive from her coat pocket. There's something else. He looked up. Luis Ortega. The night custodian. She nodded. He came to me this morning. Claire slid the drive across the table. He saw you return Vanessa's phone. Malcolm frowned slightly. I didn't know anyone was there. He checked the hallway cameras after hearing about the latest complaint. Claire allowed herself the smallest smile. The footage clearly shows you placing her phone outside her apartment untouched. Malcolm stared at the flash drive for several seconds. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I know. That's exactly why it matters. Silence settled over the room. The radiator clicked softly against the cold. From Eli's bedroom came the faint sound of pages turning. He was still awake, reading before bed. Claire looked toward the hallway. How's he doing? Malcolm answered honestly. He smiles less. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Claire opened her planner. The annual ownership meeting is tomorrow morning. I know. The board has already confirmed attendance. So have I. Claire studied him carefully. You've made your decision. I have. No more waiting. Malcolm looked toward the brass house keychain resting beside the photograph of Eli's wrist. Its newest dent caught the kitchen light. No more waiting. Claire exhaled slowly, almost with relief. What happens tomorrow? Malcolm closed the binder containing all 10 reports. Tomorrow, he said quietly, everyone who believed these were separate misunderstandings is going to see the whole picture. Outside, snow began falling again over Lakeview Terrace. Across the courtyard, Vanessa turned off her desk lamp after dropping the sealed envelope into the outgoing mail slot. She smiled to herself. She believed the mysterious owner would finally remove the troublesome man from apartment 8F. She never imagined. The first person who would read her letter the next morning had already finished reading it that very night. The next morning arrived colder than any before it. A thin layer of ice coated the sidewalks outside Lakeview Terrace, and every breath drifted through the parking lot like pale smoke. Residents hurried toward work with scarves wrapped tightly around their necks, unaware that the ordinary rhythm of the building was about to stop. Inside apartment 8F, Malcolm zipped Eli's winter coat. You ready for your spelling test? Eli managed a small smile. I studied. I know you did. Before opening the apartment door, Malcolm reached into the kitchen drawer. The little brass house keychain rested exactly where he had left it after reading Vanessa's letter. He picked it up. The fresh dent was still there. Instead of clipping it back onto Eli's backpack, Malcolm slipped it quietly into his own pocket. "I'll hold on to this today," he said. Eli nodded. "Grandpa would have wanted you to." Together, they rode the elevator to the lobby. Waiting beside the entrance were 6 archive boxes filled with audit reports, maintenance contracts, financial records, and employee evaluations Malcolm had spent weeks reviewing. He loaded them carefully into the rear of his SUV. Every box represented another piece of the truth. Across the courtyard, Vanessa watched from behind her dining room curtains. She recognized the boxes immediately. Management files. Internal records. She grabbed her phone before Malcolm closed the tailgate. "This is Vanessa Collins from Lakeview Terrace." Her voice was calm. "The man I've reported before is stealing building documents." She paused. "Yes. He's loading everything into his vehicle right now. This needs to be stopped." She ended the call without hesitation. Less than 2 minutes later, a black security SUV turned sharply into the driveway. Its tires crunched across frozen pavement before stopping directly across Malcolm's path. The exit was completely blocked. Gavin Price climbed out first. 2 officers followed. His expression was harder than Malcolm had ever seen before. "Step away from the vehicle." Malcolm did exactly that. Eli watched from the back seat, still buckled in, his backpack resting beside him. "Dad?" "I'm here." Gavin pointed toward the open cargo area. "We received a report that you're removing confidential property belonging to building management." "They're being transported for a scheduled meeting. I'll decide that after I inspect them." Without waiting for permission, Gavin walked to the rear of the SUV and grabbed the nearest archive box. He pulled it toward himself. The bottom split open. Hundreds of pages burst across the frozen pavement. Maintenance invoices, employee reports, audit summaries. They scattered across the driveway, sliding beneath parked cars and catching against the curb. For one long moment, no one moved. Then Gavin looked back at Malcolm. "I need your hands where I can see them." His hands settled against the restraints on his belt. Inside the SUV, Eli slammed both palms against the window. "Dad!" Fear filled his voice. Malcolm looked at his son first. Always his son first. Only then did he turn back toward Gavin. "I'm going to reach into my jacket." "Don't." "I need to." "What for?" "My identification." Gavin's shoulders tightened. Slowly. Malcolm nodded once. Every movement remained calm, measured, intentional. His fingers disappeared inside his coat. The parking lot had become completely silent. Residents stood frozen near the lobby doors. Luis had stopped pushing his cleaning cart. Mrs. Carter covered her mouth. Vanessa stepped closer to her balcony railing, unable to look away. Malcolm withdrew the small brass house. For an instant, Gavin frowned in confusion. "That's your identification?" "No." Malcolm walked calmly past the scattered papers, toward the old oak door beside the leasing office. Few residents ever noticed it. It had no apartment number, no directory, only an old brass lock beneath a faded plaque reading Management Archive. Malcolm inserted the brass house into a narrow, hidden slot beneath the lock. There was a quiet, mechanical click. Then another. The heavy door unlocked. He opened it. Inside, a private office overlooked the lobby below. Claire Bennett stepped out first. Behind her came 3 members of the ownership board carrying meeting folders. The oldest board member stopped the moment he saw Malcolm. "Good morning, Mr. Avery." Every sound disappeared. Claire looked directly at Gavin. "Why is the owner of this building being detained on the morning of the annual review?" Gavin's face drained of colour. His eyes shifted from Claire to the board members, to the open archive office, then back to Malcolm. The realization arrived all at once. The man he had blocked. The father whose boxes he had spilled across the driveway. The quiet resident reported 12 separate times, owned every brick surrounding them. Gavin instinctively bent to gather the scattered papers. Malcolm stopped him with one calm sentence. "Please leave everything exactly where it is." Gavin froze. The command carried no anger, only authority. Behind him, Eli opened the SUV door and ran toward his father. Malcolm knelt immediately, wrapping one arm around the trembling boy. "It's okay." Eli buried his face against Malcolm's coat. "You came back. I always will." Standing only a few yards away, Vanessa stared at the brass house still resting in Malcolm's hand. For the first time since the day he moved into apartment 8F, she finally understood what it had opened all along. No one spoke. The cold morning seemed to hold its breath as snow drifted quietly through the parking lot. Vanessa looked from Malcolm to Claire, to the members of the ownership board. Her letter, the one she had written so carefully, the one she believed would persuade the mysterious owner to remove Malcolm from Lakeview Terrace. The owner had been reading it at his own kitchen table the night before. Claire bent down and picked up the scattered audit reports, one careful stack at a time. "They stay exactly as they are," Malcolm said gently. "They're now evidence." Gavin lowered his head. Mr. Avery." Malcolm looked at him without anger. "You acted on a complaint." He paused. "But you never stopped to ask why. There had already been 11 others." Gavin swallowed hard. "I should have." You should have noticed a pattern." The words were firm, but calm. They carried disappointment far more than punishment. Claire turned toward the board members. "I believe the scheduled ownership meeting should begin." "It already has," Malcolm answered quietly. He looked around the courtyard where residents had gathered in silence. "In fact, everyone who needs to hear this is already here." Later that morning, the community room on the first floor filled more completely than anyone could remember. Residents occupied every chair. Security officers stood along the back wall. Luis remained near the doorway, uncertain whether he belonged inside. Malcolm noticed him immediately. "Mr. Ortega." Luis looked surprised. "Please join us. I work here. So do the decisions we're about to make." Luis slowly took an empty seat. Claire presented the findings first. One complaint after another appeared on the projection screen. Helping Mrs. Carter, repairing Noah's bicycle, shoveling snow, replacing Amanda's lock, returning Vanessa's lost phone. Each incident was paired with security footage, maintenance logs, or witness statements. What had sounded suspicious when separated became unmistakably different when placed together. It wasn't a pattern of misconduct. It was a pattern of kindness. The room grew quieter with every page. Then came the photograph of the faint red mark on Eli's wrist. No commentary followed. None was necessary. Malcolm stood only after every document had been shown. "I didn't keep these records because I wanted someone punished." His voice remained steady. "I kept them because my father taught me that problems hidden long enough become traditions. He looked around the room. A building doesn't fail all at once. It fails one ignored moment at a time. His eyes met Gavin's. One unquestioned report. Then Vanessa's. One assumption. Finally, the residents. One person deciding another doesn't belong. Silence settled over the room. Vanessa slowly stood. For the first time since Malcolm had moved into Lakeview Terrace, certainty had completely left her face. I was wrong. The words came quietly. I convinced myself I was protecting this community. She lowered her eyes. I never realized I had become the one making it less safe. No one applauded. No one interrupted. Apologies mattered. But Malcolm had learned they mattered most when followed by action. Claire unfolded the board's recommendations. After an independent review, Gavin would be suspended pending mandatory retraining and evaluation under a revised security policy focused on recognizing patterns of repeated complaints before escalating enforcement. Vanessa would step down from the Resident Advisory Committee immediately. If she wished to remain at Lakeview Terrace, she would spend the next year volunteering with the building's new resident welcome program under board supervision, helping newcomers settle into the community she had once tried to control. Every repeated complaint against the same resident would now require supervisory review before further action, and Luis Ortega, whose honesty had preserved evidence no one else thought to notice, accepted an invitation to serve on the newly formed Resident and Staff Advisory Council. The meeting ended without celebration. Real repair rarely sounded like applause. That afternoon, Malcolm finally drove Eli to school. They were late. His teacher simply smiled. We'll call this an excused absence. Weeks passed. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Chicago. Neighbors who once looked away now stopped to ask Eli about his model trains. Mrs. Carter baked cookies every Friday. Amanda trusted her daughter to knock on apartment 8F whenever she needed help. Even Gavin, after completing his retraining, quietly apologized to Malcolm again, not because Malcolm owned the building, but because he finally understood that respect should never depend on knowing who someone was. One Saturday morning, Malcolm sat on the front bench, watching children draw with sidewalk chalk near the entrance. Beside him, Eli carefully held the little brass house. The dent was still there. Malcolm had chosen not to polish it away. It reminds us, he said, of Grandpa, and of what we're building. A moving truck pulled into the parking lot. Another young family climbed out, looking around with the same uncertainty Malcolm had carried 5 weeks earlier. Without waiting to be asked, Eli walked over. In his hand was a small gift bag. Inside rested a brand new brass house keychain. I thought you might like this, he told the family's youngest daughter. So you'll always know, this is your home. The little girl smiled. Her parents thanked him. From the bench, Malcolm watched quietly. He realized he wasn't looking at the building his father had left behind anymore. He was looking at the community his son had helped restore. Lakeview Terrace had never needed a stronger owner. It had needed people willing to make strangers feel like neighbors. And Malcolm finally understood that the greatest thing his father had ever handed him wasn't a building. It was the responsibility to make everyone inside it feel like they belonged. When Eli handed that brand new brass house keychain to the little girl moving into Lakeview Terrace, he wasn't just welcoming a new neighbor. He was proving that his father's quiet choices had become his son's way of seeing the world. This story reminds us that the real cost of prejudice isn't measured by the people we push away. It's measured by the trust and kindness we almost destroy along the way. The hardest apologies aren't spoken with words. They're proven by the changes we're willing to make afterward. Today, think about one person you've quietly judged before ever knowing their story. Follow Malcolm's example and choose one small act of fairness instead of one quick assumption. You may never realize how much that moment matters. If Malcolm and Eli's journey stayed with you, comment 1 below. And tell me this, have you ever been misunderstood by someone who never took the time to know you? I'd love to read your story. Stay with me, because the next story begins with another ordinary moment that changes a family's life in a way no one sees coming.